Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Associate Professor of Communication at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on X at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. In this episode, we're going to be focused on journalism and how news reporting is interacting with some of the changes that we're seeing in the social media landscape. And my guest to discuss this is Jacob Ward. He is a reporter in residence at the Omidyar Network and has worked at some of the world's largest news organizations, from Al Jazeera, PBS, NBC News, and CNN. But what's interesting about Jacob is he's also been very successful sort of cultivating his own audience on TikTok, where videos get millions of views. He's also got a Substack and a podcast called The Rip Current, where he talks about issues of technology and politics, which was also his beat often as a journalist. And so what we'll talk about in this episode is things like the 24-hour news cycle. I mean, should we even think of a news cycle anymore? We'll also talk about the differences in reporting in a mainstream news organization versus this kind of independent journalism, and then the sort of influencers who aren't journalists by trade, but become news influencers, particularly for certain political ideologies, which is kind of interesting because they don't really actually source their own news, but they're reliant on the internet and then just amplify it. So we'll talk about what Jacob is doing with TikTok, how he's thinking about the relationship between using that as a sort of brainstorming and outreach platform versus how that compares to more traditional styles of journalism where you have editorial oversight and have resources to do this type of investigative journalism. So overall, I think it's just an interesting look into what is it like to be a journalist today when there are so many options of how you can tell a story and reach an audience. So without further ado, let me turn it over to my guest, Jacob Ward. Again, he is a reporter in residence at the Omidyar Network. Jake, thanks so much for taking the time out. Welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Michael, I really appreciate you having me here.
So to start out here, I'd like to get your thoughts on the news cycle as a concept. I mean, you've worked at some of the highest levels in journalism, and I'm just curious to ask, like, when you look out across today's media environment, is the idea of a news cycle still useful for understanding how news works today?
This is such a smart question, and I wonder what I think about that. Let's see. I guess I would say the notion of a news cycle, I think, definitely still exists. At least, as someone who has worked inside a bunch of newsrooms, I can definitely tell you that that is still the case. And I know that because I tend to be what they call the bounce story player. So basically, there will be a sort of the lead-off story on a topic will be, let's say there's an officer-involved shooting, right? A Breonna Taylor kind of situation. What I remember from working, for instance, at Al Jazeera is I would then be pitching my angle on it, which is, because basically in my world, I'm trying to show what technology and the systems built around technology tell us about ourselves and about society. And so I would do something like, here's an officer-involved shooting. You have the lead-off reporter on that. And then maybe the second day, or it depends on maybe it would happen on the same day, but the second pass for me would be, how do body cameras work? What are the rules around body cameras? When are they admissible as evidence? And I would pitch that kind of bounce story and get it on, but it very often didn't last more than, the interest doesn't last more than 24, 48 hours because, especially now that we're living in Steve Bannon's world where famously he, wants to quote unquote flood the zone, right? And has told all of the political operatives that follow him, you should flood the zone because he's aware that there's only so much capacity and the news cycle only lasts so long. And if you just hit the journalism infrastructure with more than it can handle, it starts to break down. And I think that is turning out to be absolutely true. So yes, I do think that the idea of a news cycle still exists, but it is, as we're all experiencing in the exhaustion of trying to absorb news, collapsing to a shorter and shorter time frame.
Yeah, that's interesting. As you were talking, I was thinking about, like, from media theory, we have these ideas about episodic versus thematic media coverage, where the episodic is kind of following individual events and then the thematic turns it into a longer story. It seems like your bounce position was exactly taking that episodic, turning it into a theme, and maybe there's just not enough attention for people to follow themes anymore.
Well, and there's also, the one of the competitive differentiators for certainly a breaking news place is that you are trying to report on the most current events you possibly can, which means that what I think about, which tends to be either stuff that's happening thematically in aggregate over time, or in some cases, things that I believe are poised to happen, even though they haven't yet. Sometimes those things fall outside the realm of news. So I've had I once had an assignment editor, basically say to me like, what you're saying is interesting and very compelling, but we're in the news business and you're talking about a thing that has not happened yet. And so we cannot, I don't think, in good faith report on that, and there's that tension. I've also been in the position where I've tried to write a script, where I'm talking about the subject that's near and dear to my heart, which is the whole eroding of human agency that's coming through AI systems. I wrote a whole book about it and I think about that all the time. And I remember turning in one script that was like, AI is eroding human agency or something like that. I don't think I got that phrasing through the system, but I remember the anchor slapped the word tonight on the front of it. Tonight, human agency eroding by AI. And that's the perfect encapsulation of the tension that we are all in the news business of, especially for me trying to cover the future and the big themes here.
Right. So you've already hinted at this idea of kind of editorial oversight, but you've been able to attract the followership, across many platforms in a way that isn't really tied to a particular news outlet. So how has that shift changed your sense of journalistic freedom, and what do you gain and what might you lose when you're not under this traditional editorial oversight?
Yeah, well, so you're putting it in a very kind way. Yeah. So I've got a following on TikTok. I have a YouTube channel. I have a podcast. I am now what one would call an independent journalist. And it's wonderfully liberating on the one hand, right? No one is slapping the word tonight on the front of my scripts anymore. And I'm able to find and engage an audience who are particularly interested in my weird kind of Daniel Kahneman Black Mirror shtick. My coverage has to do with kind of the circuitry of human psychology and the circuitry of technology and how those things and the business incentives around them, come into conflict, shape one another, that kind of stuff. So I've been able to find a niche that I think you couldn't necessarily in the traditional system. You'd have a hard time articulating what that niche is and that there's an audience for it. And so that's been wonderful. I love that part of it. What I don't like is the lack of institutional resources. And what I don't like is the lack of teamwork. I really miss working in a group of people for every time that, you called it oversight, and there is oversight. But I would say that oversight for me in the media world is actually an extremely positive thing, not least because we're held to certain standards that I think no individual can truly be entrusted to enforce on themselves all the time. And every time I would get frustrated about having to argue about, make the case for some piece I want to do or some language I want to use or whatever it is, that is of course frustrating, but it also really causes me to evaluate the work at a higher standard than I think I do as an independent operator. I really think that the audience is not well served. I think just like the public is not well served by folks like me scrambling to put out content as fast as we possibly can without any kind of coordination, right? When a newsroom gets a Breonna Taylor story, they have the wherewithal to say, okay, you're going to be the person who stands in front of the scene. Okay, you're the person who's going to do the body camera story. Okay, you're going to be the person in DC who does the political fallout, right? You can truly surround a story when an institution is doing the air traffic control on it in a way that independent journalists are all going to hit either the primary angle or a bunch of weird niche angles that aren't going to necessarily, I think, surround the story in that fundamental day one way that you want. So I miss, if I had my druthers, Michael, I would totally be like, I really like working in an institution. I can't believe I sort of feel that way, but I really like it. Now that I've learned a little bit about what I like to cover independently, I'd love to carry some of that in. And I think I've demonstrated there's an audience for that. But I don't know. I remember I had a experience once right after President Biden's election where I was dispatched by NBC News to Las Vegas, and I was outside the Clark County Registrar of Voters in the middle of the night. I remember flying in at like 11 at night or something, and I'm going live at like 1 in the morning or something because we're doing all night coverage as there are these huge Stop the Steal conspiracy theory protests going on outside these boards of elections. And we're in Clark County. We're in this like weird kind of like the way this building was set up. It was kind of like an amphitheater, and we were at the bottom of the amphitheater. We were on the stage in a way, and all these protesters are up and around us, up above us, almost a full story above us. And I'll remind you, like, this is an open carry state, so there are people there in fatigues and semi-automatic weapons that they're brandishing. A lot of people are drunk. This is a seriously dangerous place to be a journalist. I remember just thinking, like, this is a scary assignment. And then in the crowd, there are some camera lights, and a correspondent is like in the middle of this drunken crowd. And I remember thinking, whoa, who is she? Like, that's the bravest of all of us. Like, what is she doing? And in between hits, without a camera on me, I go just to try and see who it is, just to sort of figure it out. And I realize, oh, wow, this is a person leading the chants of "We love you, President Trump." She's leading the crowd in chanting. And I was like, oh, she's not a journalist. She's a YouTuber. And I find her on YouTube, and there she is, and she's got the chat window up that lets you leave a tip for her and the whole thing. And I remember just having this thought of like, this is independent work. And I consider it to bear no resemblance to what I'm here doing. And yet, if extraterrestrials were to land and ask, well, what do you guys both do? Well, we both make money trying to bring attention to a story. It would make us seem identical. And under the First Amendment, we have the same legal protections. But I just think that's the weird moment we're in right now, where what she was doing, what I was doing are ostensibly identical in the independent journalism landscape, even though if I did anything like what she had been doing in terms of leading the crowd and chanting or anything, I'd be fired instantly from a place like NBC. So I just remember that experience, me thinking like, wow, journalism is in a very weird place, a different place than it once was.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm interested in, is this idea of like independent journalism and how it relates to technology. Because I mean, we had blogs and then Twitter and then podcasts, Substack, YouTube, TikTok. You mentioned that kind of pressure to self-publish, but I mean, how do you view that technological advancement and its relationship to independent journalism? I mean, I guess live streaming is probably one of the bigger revolutions, but also just the speed and pace of things.
Yeah, I mean, the pace is incredible. The research capacity. I mean, so my grandmother, once upon a time, ran a women's group in Connecticut, and she was one of the very first people in the United States to assemble a dossier on what was going on in Vietnam. And this was like the early 60s. This is before American involvement in Vietnam. And I found we were going through her things after she passed, and there are letters from, I think it's CBS News, saying, "Dear Mrs. Ward, we understand that you have this dossier on Vietnam. Please find enclosed an addressed envelope and postage to send it to us. Please do." Right? That is a TV producer who somehow has figured out that there's, a ladies group in suburban Connecticut who has information he needs about the growing problem in Vietnam, right? He can't go online and check it out. I just think about the, having to write letters to get sourcing on a story or to confirm a story. Like, it's just incredible that work even got done back then, considering how fast I can right now, review all 50 states worth of AI laws and confirm a fact in moments. That stuff is absolutely incredible, and I'm grateful for it. I'm glad that exists. I'm also incredibly glad that the disintermediation of the news and of journalism in general means that you don't need the permission of what had historically been a deeply racist, deeply systemically biased system in which people only like me, a white dude, were allowed to deliver the day's events. Like, the diversity of opinion and background that is now part of journalism, because you no longer need the permission of people who own a printing press or own a satellite dish, is incredible. Wonderful. Love that. What I don't like is that it doesn't take almost anything to declare oneself a journalist. And this new world of newsfluencer, of which I am one, is a weird one where people are talking about, we have breaking news at this hour. And I think to myself, when I hear somebody say that on YouTube, I'm like, I'm sorry, you have what? Do you have it? Like, like, how do you know that? Like, you've read a thing and I can also read that thing, but like the whole standard of like what constitutes reporting is so different now. And what, of course, I think is coming next, and this is the really scary part for me, and this is what I spend so much of my time covering, is what AI generated content is going to do that world, where suddenly you're going to have people illustrating, imaginary stories with extremely real looking photographs and videos, right? All of that and audio and the rest of it. Like, all of that is going to, I think, make the difference between, a quote unquote credentialed institutional journalism outfit and a random YouTuber even more important, even though I think it'll make it that much harder for the institutional version of this stuff to survive as a business.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of this idea of sourcing as a news influencer. Like, of course it makes sense, but like, how would a news influencer uncover something original? Like, they just have to be kind of the fastest person to find something on the internet.
And they're all, and they are, I was just talking to somebody the other day who was saying that they weren't worried about the collapse of traditional journalism because so much of the ecosystem of YouTube, when it comes to news content, relies on, a Reuters feed, an Associated Press feed, something like, one of those things for them to have the fuel they need for their content. That's also true, this person was pointing out, in terms of like headline making interviews. You need the CNNs and NBCs and CBSs of the world to like land a big interview with the president that we can cut up and put across social media, across these newsfluencer, this landscape. But my rejoinder to that person was, yeah, but that doesn't mean that there's money to be made booking those interviews. There's no money coming back to the source when you have 100,000 newsfluencers commanding audiences of millions on YouTube. None of that money is flowing back to AP or Reuters or CBS or NBC or anybody, right? So just because they quote unquote need it doesn't mean that that business is going to survive. And that's a thing that I really think we've lost sight of in this landscape.
Right. If anything, it's going to YouTube.
Yeah, well, that's right. And YouTube is not, as we know, putting that money back. There's nothing coming back to the publishers other than what they can secure for themselves. And in the AI landscape, where you're no longer following links anywhere, you're just reading a summary and moving on, that's the end of that publishing model. So it's a scary time in terms of the business survival of the industry.
Definitely. And I'm curious to hear about, I want to get to like the TikTok and news influencer more in detail in a second, but because you've worked at some of these really major publishing brands, PBS, Al Jazeera, CNN, NBC. I'm just curious about how that kind of brand interacts with your idea of journalism. Now that you've sort of gone independent, you must carry various types of cultures and experiences from that past work. So how does that kind of inform what you do today?
Yeah, well, and I would just say this to your listenership, like if you're thinking of hiring somebody for a gig and you don't know how to do it, don't let the algorithm choose for you. I would say your first stop should be a news producer. And I differentiate between myself, a correspondent, and a news producer. The folks that work at any of these places that I've worked are some of the hardest working, most resourceful people I've ever encountered. And I worked for many years in other forms of media. And so I will just say, like, a television news producer, what's cool about it is just the ways in which that industry really seems to kind of filter for a very particular kind of attitude and creativity and level of responsibility. I remember as a kid, I used to have this feeling, and I remember comparing notes with other people in news and them saying the same thing. As a kid, I remember I'd be doing homework or something, and I would have this weird instinct where I'd say to myself, man, if the rest of the universe, like if, let's say all of human civilization is vaporized and the only thing that's left is this thing I've written, then I got to make sure that it's, that I haven't messed up the quote in my paper here or whatever it is. Like it was this weird kind of, I don't know, it was one of my many pieces of OCD. And that is such a common thread in people that you meet in news who really are very, very focused on the idea of getting it right, of not misquoting people, not mischaracterizing what they say. There's a standard, I just wish, I mean, honestly, Michael, I just wish we did a better job as journalists of explaining the rules we abide by. I have a long thing on my site, theripcurrent.com, where I try and explain the rules I follow, because I think people just think we're making it up, and they don't know that, like, we follow, like, one of the major rules of editing in both television and audio journalism is you're not allowed to break apart the question you've asked on camera or on the tape and the first thing that comes out of the respondent's mouth. You're not allowed to separate out the question and then, even though it would be sometimes more convenient, to jump ahead to the core of their answers. You have to run the real connection between what was asked and what was first said in response. And that kind of rule is true wherever you go. And so I really have enjoyed, I've really liked the discovery that there's this, like, common DNA among all of these places in terms of a commitment to that stuff. Now, I've worked at, a PBS, an Al Jazeera. Those are places that don't have to basically be quite as audience and revenue motivated as a place that is more of a private open market journalism enterprise. But even with that difference, everybody seems to have this same kind of commitment. And I don't mean to be hokey about it, but I really, really like that. I think it's a holy responsibility, and people tend to take it pretty seriously.
Absolutely, which, as you mentioned, with the kind of list of guidelines, you have some sort of ethics that you developed, I guess, personally through working with those various publishers. But then, of course, now you're on TikTok, where you have 100,000 followers, and people can do whatever they want. So how are you thinking about TikTok as a journalistic platform? Like, what types of stories or commentaries are you trying there?
Well, so I was just talking to a fellow journalist the other day who I was encouraging to get onto TikTok because she has such a specific and very cool niche that I think really needs to be out in the world more. And she was saying, well, I've been, in this standards, we have inside these networks, every network has typically a standards department, a senior set of editors and a lawyer who look at, what you say and approve it before you go on air. And, and so she was like, if you're just kind of winging it on social media, how do you be careful, essentially? And I sort of said, well, I just think what you're there to do is think out loud. You're not there to answer the questions definitively. You're there to ask them and wonder about them openly. And that's the attitude I try to bring to TikTok is, here is the opinion I have developed by observing this thing over time. Here's where I have no idea what the answer is, but I think it's really important that we all be thinking about it together. And here's where I'm frustrated as to our progress, that kind of thing. What people on TikTok are really trying to do is not, and I think, like, it only ever tends to work when there's a true, like, open wondering about the world. The essence of TikTok, whether it's people giving you the play-by-play of the bad date they just went on, or sharing their anxieties about being a parent while they're waiting to pick up their kids in the car, like, it's that kind of discourse that makes TikTok so amazing. And so that's what I try and participate in. It's just sort of like, I don't really know where this is going. I don't have the answers here, but I'm thinking about this, this, and this. Here's how I'm prioritizing my concerns, and here's what I'm thinking about. So that's sort of the general tone of it. And in my case, what I'm specifically doing on TikTok is basically offering up right now I'm experimenting with headlines. I'm basically saying, like, here are the big headlines that are in my specific world of sort of tech and psychology and human emotions and how they get manipulated. I'll touch on the big stories of that day. I'll sometimes drill into one, particular one that I think is particularly interesting. I think it's takes, right? I mean, I'm offering these takes, but I'm trying not to do it in the sense of, I really try and qualify what I say and say, I don't know the answer to this, but this is what I'm sort of interested in doing it. And I think that so far has worked pretty well. I don't know why young people want to listen to an old person like me on TikTok, but for some reason, the thing I keep getting back from people when they do explain to me what they're interested in, or when they do offer an appreciation of what I'm doing, they always use the word authentic. They always just say, you seem to be authentic. And I have been told in the past, like, how I am speaking to you, Michael, how I am on TikTok, how I am with my kids. Like, I try to be the same in each of those formats rather than putting on a tie, dressing up, being a very particular way. So that's been the theme for me.
Interesting, because this open wondering, I mean, obviously connects to authenticity because you're not pretending you have the answer. And I can see how that totally kind of feeds the immediacy of the platform. Like, the scrolling through videos. But then I'm curious how it ages. Like if you pose a question that you're wondering about and then you end up answering it later on, then it kind of sits on the internet. And is that something that you think about and kind of go back and clean up? Or is just TikTok not really for looking at personal pages and sticking to the feed?
It is so, that's a really good point and a really good question. Once upon a time, I would have felt enormous responsibility for going back and cleaning it up when I was under an institutional aegis. But I now absolutely just sort of, I think I've just been indoctrinated by the idea that we're just, playing with live ammo, like you're just going and you don't go back. I mean, I go back and I try to be extremely open about how my thinking has changed over time. Like autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars is a thing I'm really grappling with right now, where my thinking on that and my sort of public position on that has changed over time, where once upon a time I was extremely positive about it in the abstract, self-driving cars, because I thought they would save lives. Then I got pretty cynical as I watched companies really minimize some of the very dangerous edge cases that they were perpetrating in the live experimentation on real human streets. And now I'm back to really believing that these things are going to be essential for saving 40,000 lives a year. And what I just try and do each time is just say, here's what I'm thinking. Here's how it changes from where I was. And just be as honest as I can about that over time. Because again, I think that when you deliver too much certainty right now is where it gets you into trouble. Because who can be certain about anything these days? And so I just feel like it's got to have that attitude, or people will immediately either not believe you or want to shoot down the certainty of your argument. It draws a kind of fire that I'm also trying to avoid.
Yeah, it's kind of like the antithesis of authenticity, skepticism.
I think that's right. It's all an experiment. And, let's be perfectly clear. Like, I have no idea how I'm going to make a living in the next few years. So I haven't solved this problem by any means, but that's been the choreography that's worked for me so far.
Interesting. So now the $1,000,000 question, which is some of your videos go absolutely viral and get millions of views, and then others only get a couple thousand. So what do you think explains that, if anything? Why some videos fly and some just don't?
Yeah, there's such a culture and industry of grifters who want to try and explain to you why a thing goes viral or not. Everyone's got this whole thing about it's got to have this hook at the beginning. You can pay thousands of dollars to have somebody teach you what those hooks are. For me, I have had, some of my most popular stuff on TikTok tends to be stuff where currently I'm sitting in my basement, which I've put an incredible amount of work into lighting, and I've got a fancy backdrop, and I've got the nice mic I'm speaking into, all of those production values, as we would call it in television, I really take pride in. And yet, I post and post and post and post from this kind of backdrop and nothing will hit. And then suddenly I'll do something, outside a rental car in front of some apartment I used to live in Seattle, and I'll reminisce about something. I've got food in my mouth, literally that one in which I'm talking about, my battles with depression in the past and trying to encourage people to sort of see past the difficulties they're in currently. That's the one that does a couple million views. It'll be for whatever reason, the ones for me that really tend to click tend to be either, it's weird. Like I want to give you a specific thing, but it's very often the offhand posts that really work. It'll be me. I gave people advice on how to deal with Thanksgiving air travel, and that one went crazy for some reason. I had another one about how to build a filter and slap it onto your box fan if there's bad air because of a nearby forest fire, as there was in New York City. That really did well. What I think the only real strategic advice I ever have for anybody is volume. Unfortunately, I really wish I could live in a world in which I could just put out one little jewel of a piece of content each week. And instead, I'm learning I got to put out at least a video a day to have a shot at going viral with any of them. And that's the trick, is just how much spaghetti can you throw at the wall? I think about that more than I think about, which piece of spaghetti is stickiest, because I just never know.
Right. You've got to feed the algorithm. And I think that gets us feed the beast. And that gets us to the idea of tech power and how it actually operates behind the scenes, which is a topic that you've reported on extensively. So I'm curious about how your use of social media might reflect the insights that you gathered in investigative journalism and your reporting about science and technology.
Yeah, well, there is certainly an extremely powerful filtration system going on that is both very helpful in some cases, but as a content creator now, can of course work against you as well. It varies from platform to platform. A place like YouTube, I think, is as just about as permissive as you can get. Like they don't really put a huge amount of, or haven't traditionally been known for putting a huge amount of effort into content moderation. I mean, they do some, but not as much as like a Meta, which once upon a time put a ton of work into content moderation. They no longer do, but they did. TikTok is a weird one because TikTok, they would tell you they're not a Chinese company, but in terms of the ethics and the playbook of it as a moderated place is very Chinese. If you say the word gun or drugs or alcohol or any of these terms, it will cut you off right there. It'll either limit the reach of the piece you've posted, or if you're doing a piece of live content, a little thing will come up and say, you've violated our terms of service, and no new people will be allowed to join this live. And so it's very interesting to see how hardcore that platform can be around, algorithmic filtering, and how for every time that it does it probably appropriately, that place really errs on the side of doing it such that it very often gets it wrong. Like I'll mention the name of a book that has the word blitz in it. It'll be like a business book, and it'll misunderstand it to mean that I'm talking about like Nazi stuff and cut me off. It's very weird.
Wow.
Yeah, it's interesting, but that is a huge, I mean, there is a huge new filtration system that our thoughts move through. Another version of this, I'll just mention, I once did a profile of a inventor who I had found on TikTok. And then I went and did another one on a different inventor who I'd also found on TikTok. And I mentioned one of them to the other, and he was like, oh yeah, we know each other through TikTok. And I remember thinking, oh wow, like this is TikTok through me shaping the zeitgeist so powerfully that like me, a national reporter, I'm choosing my subjects from people who have been already algorithmically associated with each other on TikTok. So like that was a moment where I was like, I'm not going to rely on TikTok for sources as much anymore, because this is obviously like I'm becoming an extension of the algorithm in a way that is definitely not what I want to be doing here.
But I think it also says something about like getting on the creator side. Like once you are like running your own YouTube channel, you can start to see the stats, and then it gives you a better sense of how creators are making their decisions. And I'm wondering if you view that as an asset, that you have been creating journalistic content or reflections across these various platforms. You have a really good sense of how the ecosystem works versus someone like me who just doesn't go on TikTok.
Yeah, right. I mean, one thing that I would say is really troubling to me about that ecosystem is how like data driven the truly successful creators tend to be. So they tend to, really try and, reverse engineer their content to what they see popping off in Google search terms, or, they'll A/B test one version against another version in terms of their content endlessly, and then just keep going the path of least resistance, going to where the data tells them the eyeballs are going to be, as opposed to what I was raised to believe, which is I had a superior and we were both reporting to a terrible boss. And he said to me, he was like, we can do two things. We can either try to get what we want past this guy, or we can try and anticipate what he wants. Either way, it's going to be 50-50 our chances. And so let's just try and get what we think is important out there. And it was great advice. And I've stuck with that ever since. It's like, I think that there's way too much of what is currently being pushed on social media is what these folks believe is a data-driven response to what the audience wants, quote unquote wants. I think that instead we need to be cultivating as much creativity as we can in what we are interested in, we as creators are interested in. Because you could never ask someone in advance, hey, do you want to hear a dude in his 50s hold forth about human circuitry and corruption? You'd be like, nah, that doesn't sound great. I'm more into cars, right? But it's these random people that will bump into my stuff and be like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know about that. That's the thing that TikTok does so well that I think a lot of these other platforms do not, is the discovery of truly surprising stuff. Like I didn't know I was into watching a skateboard coach teach kids how to skateboard. If you'd asked me, was I into that? I'd say no, right? But discovery and true surprise only will happen if we don't try to feed the audience what we think it already wants, and instead try and make stuff that's worthwhile, which is kind of a journalistic principle.
100%. And that's kind of like on the content of what you're doing, but then there's also the content of how you communicate it. And I'm very curious about that because, as you said, you're very interested in AI. You've done a lot of reporting on like brain science and emotions. And do you have any tips or ways of approaching how you can actually condense those complex topics into a way that the public is able to understand and then actually interested in?
Well, I would say for somebody who is, a domain expert and trying to figure out how do I get that idea out there, one thing that I always come back to, I occasionally teach courses in storytelling for experts, and one of the principles I come back to all the time is one that comes from a researcher in Oregon who is kind of a acolyte of Daniel Kahneman, who wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. He's a Nobel Prize winning economist. And one of his acolytes came up with this concept of looking at human sensitivity when it comes to basically empathy and stories. And what he was trying to study, what he was trying to figure out is what is the optimal number of people in a story that produces the greatest emotional response in people. Because what the science has told us, and this is what all my work has been about, is that like we make our decisions with our emotions. We don't make our decisions with our brains. There's a whole world of academic experts who deal in only the data, but I think you really have to deal in the emotions to get people to pay attention to what you're talking about. And so this guy, in studying this, he was specifically trying to figure out why it was that there wasn't much charitable giving at the time of enormous death in the Mediterranean as people were trying to escape the Middle East across to Europe. And he was trying to figure out what's the optimal number for provoking the greatest amount of sympathy. And he discovered in the end that the best possible number for, like, basically in his case, he was literally looking at what number of deaths provoke the greatest emotional response. And it turns out that number is 1. A single death will provoke way more emotional response than 10,000 people have died over the summer, where even though those numbers are outrageous, right, and should in theory create huge power, should set off our brains. 1, because and I connect this to like the idea that like our brains come from a time when you lived with 4 people around a campfire. Like your brain's not built for that, for big abstract numbers. So for me, I think one of the number one things that I always come back to is just like you got to build an anecdotal experience or a representative story into it. This is why news tends to focus on the plight of a single girl in a flood, right? As opposed to just saying, here's how many people were affected in this flood. It's how you get the emotional impact across. You're not just doing that for ratings, you're doing it so that people will absorb the information. And so I think that's a lesson that people really, with a very serious domain expertise, should consider. Another one is, as someone who I used to be the editor of Popular Science magazine, I've dealt with taking domain experts into the public many, many times. And one thing that they always want to do is like hand off authorship to as many people as possible and footnote everything they say and try and, no one wants to come down with 2 feet and say, here's how it is. They want to go, well, we don't really know, blah, blah. And there's a balance, I think, to be struck between the impulse to, I don't want anyone to come out with false certainty, but I think there's a way to say, we don't know for sure, but the takeaway of the last, the headline of the last 50 years in my field has been this, right? And being able to nail a common understanding, something that everybody in your field would more or less agree on, being able to articulate a handful of those gives somebody the opportunity to get into the conversation with you with the understanding that you will answer a question every so often, rather than just saying, well, we don't know and we can't know, is not a thing that's not an acceptable answer for, I think, your average person.
No, it's not. But when you are a domain expert, that's exactly what there's like a pride in saying, I don't know, because it stakes out that area that you're certain that we don't know. And you have a reason for why we don't know. But I guess that's what the public is not interested in.
Well, and I think you don't have to project false certainty, but you do need, and I realize that in a way I'm sort of contradicting something I was saying earlier, which was that I try not to deliver false certainty and I try to keep it open. But I think you got to do it in the language of being really sympathetic to your audience's interest in knowing. Like you could even sort of say something like, I would love nothing more than to be able to tell you this, that this is the answer. Or, I, like all of you, want to know this answer. And I really want us to have figured that out. Unfortunately, we haven't yet, but here's what we do know. That kind of framing gives you the opportunity to offer some confidence without offering false certainty. And I think that's an important thing.
No, 100%. And not everything needs to end with a definitive answer. We can have just open conversations and reflections as we have just here. But it's been fascinating hearing about your experiences with TikTok and bringing past journalistic network knowledge into the public sphere. So Jake, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Michael, I love to speak to people about how you can take the real expertise they have, which is such an important thing, and make great stories out of it. So I really appreciate you taking the time with me.
I've just been speaking with Jake Ward, reporter in residence at the Omidyar Network. Check out the episode description for links to his podcast, The Rip Current. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, I'll speak with Bruce Schneier and Nathan Sanders from Harvard University about how AI is being used in government. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Alamo. See you next time.